Hello, this is Father Mike Walker of Father Mike's podcast, Father Mike's Bible Study podcast, and the Catholic Combine, the pastor of St. Cecilia Catholic Church in Beaverton, Oregon. If you would like more information about the parish or the podcast, please feel free to email me at frmikewalker@gmail.com. And now, today's podcast.
So, what if Jesus didn't rise from the dead? What if he did rise from the dead? So, this question actually was something that I was thinking about when I was in college. And when I was in college, we actually didn't have the internet, so I needed to go and read books and try to figure out what I could with the information that I had at the time. And I began to notice that there was some very interesting answers to this question. And I wanted to cover a few of those with you. Also, I summarized this and put it on the parish website under Father Mike's blog. So if you want to look at a written form of it, you can look at that a little later. But the first thing I noticed was that the empty tomb was a bit of a problem, because it didn't make sense if Jesus didn't actually rise from the dead. Okay, so let me explain why that's the case. So first of all, there were the Jewish leaders and there were the Romans. And the Jewish leaders did not want to have an empty tomb. And the Romans did not want to have an empty tomb. They actually stationed guards there to make sure that that didn't happen. So it makes no sense that the Jewish leaders or the Romans or the guards would want or allow an empty tomb. And so you might think, well, yeah, but it was the disciples. Well, remember, the disciples just got done watching their Lord and Master get crucified. They thought that all their dreams were dashed and that it was hopeless. They were cowering in fear. The last things that the disciples wanted to do was to go to a tomb and try to overpower a bunch of Roman soldiers and then try to push back a stone and steal a body for a Messiah that they thought had died. So you can see that this whole thing around the empty tomb is a bit of a problem unless Jesus actually rose from the dead. But there are other details that are interesting as well. Because you'll notice that when they go into the tomb, that the clothes are all neatly folded and rolled up. Well, who goes and tries to rob a tomb and then say, oh, well, hold on a second, let me fold all the clothes and make sure everything looks nice? Now, my mom may actually do that, but normal people who are trying to overpower Roman guards, that would not be the case. Now, the story that was brought out actually was that, they came and stole the body when the guards were asleep. But in the ancient world, if you were a guard at a post and you fell asleep on your post, that would be a capital offense. So they would actually be killed for that. And so the Roman soldiers had a real incentive not to let this happen to begin with. And so the whole thing just kind of speaks about something great happening here. And there are other little details that we see later on. For example, when Jesus rises from the dead, he doesn't do it in a way that we would think he should have, or if we were going to make it up, that we would tell a different story. So one example is that the first witnesses of the resurrection were women. Now, that doesn't seem like a big deal to us, but in the ancient world, women were not considered reliable witnesses. And so therefore, if you're going to make up a story about someone rising from the dead, you wouldn't have him, showing himself to women. You would have him showing himself to men because they're more credible witnesses in that time. The other thing is that he has a resurrected body. It's not just a spirit. So you see Jesus where he's eating with the disciples and he's saying, here, touch my side and my hands. So it's a real body. But on the other hand, he tends to appear and then disappear. And he tends to be able to go through walls, and that the way that he is different as well, because people don't always recognize who he is until he lets them know who he is, like Mary Magdalene, for example. And so all of the details around this don't make sense if you're just going to make up a story about him rising from the dead, and you're going to make up a story about disciples who would have no incentive to make up that story Because if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, why would they then go out and preach to all the world that he did, and then go to their own death, often by torture, for a story that they know is not true? So again, you can see that the more reasonable story is to say that, well, Jesus did rise from the dead. Now, interestingly enough, the people who are trying to counter this story, the earliest references to that, they tended to take it for granted that Jesus rose from the dead, but they had other explanations about how and why it happened, which is also pretty interesting as well. You also have what happened afterwards, because after Jesus rose from the dead, there were other witnesses. Now, we don't often think of this. We might think that only a small number of people actually saw Jesus rise from the dead, but that's not the case. 1 Corinthians 15, St. Paul explains this, and he's talking to the church in Corinth. And he tells them that look, in Jerusalem, he appeared to 500 people in one day. And if you don't believe me, go there yourself, because many of those people are still alive. So what St. Paul is saying is, like, this is such a well-known event that hundreds of people saw Jesus rise from the dead. And all you need to do is go there and talk to the hundreds of people who are still around, and they will verify what I'm talking about. And Jesus also rose and appeared to St. Paul, so he has firsthand knowledge of that as well. So you can see that the testimony of those early witnesses are pretty powerful because they're so large in number. Another thing, that the church grew, and the faith went out to all the world, and the numbers grew in a huge amount. Now, this was something that was actually in the prophets. Both Isaiah and Zechariah talked about that. They said that when the Messiah comes, that there is going to be such a great event that not only Jews but Gentiles are also going to be children of God and are going to come into the fold. And this is exactly what happened. It was the one event that happened that fulfilled those prophecies, where the Jews and the Gentiles both came to be people of God and grew in such huge numbers. Now, in addition to this, you also have the witness of the various saints that have had experiences of the risen Christ. And actually, probably many of us have also had experiences of the risen Christ in one way or another. So the reason why I'm explaining this is because it is more reasonable to believe that Jesus rose from the dead than he didn't. But then, of course, the follow-up question to this is, well, okay, then what happened after this, and why does it matter? Well, we all know what happens. The disciples were emboldened. They went out and they proclaimed the gospel, and they established churches, and the people came to believe, and the world was transformed and changed for the better because Jesus rose from the dead. If he didn't, none of this makes any sense. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about this. So last week, I was doing some yard work. And when I do yard work, I often will put in headphones and I'll listen to different podcasts and audiobooks and things. So this one time, I'm a little embarrassed to mention this because I was listening to the Joe Rogan podcast, and it was Michael Shellenberger that he was interviewing. And the reason was I read one of the books by Michael Shellenberger, and I thought, oh, this could be interesting. So anyway, I was listening to the podcast, and they started talking about Jesus. And I was a little worried because before that they were talking about UFOs, so you don't know where this is going. But interestingly enough, what they said was very insightful. And so I'm going to read you some of their dialogue. The Christian story is so beautiful and so important. What an insanely wise human being. No one else in history is like Jesus. There have been terrible things done in the guise of Christianity, but if you listen to his teachings, they weren't following his teachings. A lot of young people are getting into Christianity, and that's a good thing. It works. If you live as a Christian, you'll have a better life. If you want to live a better life, a love-filled, wonderful life that's real with peace, love, and richness, it's better for everyone. It's a real thing. Or maybe you're just a meat suit and worm food and your life doesn't matter and everything is random and pointless. That's a terrible story. But if people would follow his teachings, they would all be better off for it. Anyway, it's kind of funny coming from the two podcasters there. Now, that is true. If you just live the Christian life, you're going to have a better life. But there's more to this life than just the life we have here on earth. That we're more than just material beings. We're also spiritual beings. We're body and soul. And we were created in a particular way where we crave the connection to the divine in the spiritual world. And St. Augustine wrote about this. He said that our hearts are restless until they rest in you. St. Paul wrote about it too. He says, if we live for this world only, we're the most pitiable of people. So what they're all recognizing is that we have a natural desire to have a connection with the spiritual world where our God is reigning over all and we are connected to him. And that spiritual life that we have is something that is very real as well. And it gives us the answers to those ultimate questions that we all have. Like, why am I here? What is this world about? What is it that God wants me to do? Who am I? You know, that these ultimate questions come through exploring the spiritual world. Now, in the last week also, I was kind of at a point where I was just kind of feeling pretty good about everything. I was feeling spiritually connected to God, and I was reading particular things, and the scripture reading and the prayer and everything was kind of coming together. And I remembered thinking that, wow, I'm really happy right now. And usually when you have that feeling, you got to be a little worried, right? Because you're thinking, okay, something's happening, something's coming up. But anyway, I was just kind of feeling really content with life and the way things were and where we were headed and the church and everything else. Well, anyway, on Good Friday, so I got a migraine. And I get those, I don't get them often, but when I do get them, I get the type that I can't think, I can't speak, I can't do anything. I've got blind spots. And anyway, so as soon as I felt it starting to come on, I did the pill that's supposed to help, but it always takes too long to work, and it really doesn't even work that well. So I call Deacon Felix, and I say, hey, Deacon, I'm starting to get a migraine, and tell Father Brent not to leave, because he was just finishing the English service, and so we had the Spanish to do, which I was supposed to do the Spanish. And I knew that I wasn't going to be able to function well enough to do the Spanish, so I asked Deacon Felix to get a hold of Father Brent, and so Father Brent actually had to work double on Friday night. But it was strange, because this was the first time that I went from Holy Thursday to Easter, and I totally skipped over Good Friday. So there was something kind of missing in this week. But there's something deeper to that, right? There's this spiritual connection that we have, and the full story that the Lord gives us, that if we are connected to that, our lives are better off. Now, okay, so looking at all these different things, there's always the next question is like, well, what do we do now? What do we do with this? Well, I think we don't need to make it more difficult than it needs to be. Look at what the disciples did. So when the disciples recognized the reality of the resurrection in their life and how it affected them both physically and spiritually, they just simply went out into the world and brought that good news to those around them. But they also came together, they celebrated Mass, they prayed, they learned about the gospel, and they lived the teachings of Jesus. It's really not a difficult thing to figure out what to do next. And with all of this, of course, we have that same opportunity that the disciples had 2,000 years ago. So the resurrection is not just something that is an event that happened 2,000 years ago. It's something that the fruits and the reality of it are being brought about even in the present day. Last night, we had about 70 people who joined the church. And so many of them were baptized, and many received confirmation. My arm was actually getting sore by doing all the confirmations toward the end of it. But as a priest, I just love to see how God works in the lives of people and just seeing the transformation that happens to them as they allow God to actually do what he wants to do in their lives. And it's really the high point of being a priest. There are many reasons why I like being a priest, but that's one of the highlights to that. And so today, think about the resurrection, but don't just believe it for what happened 2,000 years ago. Consider what it means for you today. That your perspective, how you see life and how you live life, could be different if you allow the fruit and the reality of the resurrection to be lived out in you and through you. And if you are, what happened 2,000 years ago continues to happen today, and the reality of the resurrection gets lived out through us, in us, and through the many people we know and love.
Thank you for listening to today's podcast. May God bless you and be with you as you live out your faith and serve the Lord this week.